Hello, and welcome to Music Therapy and Beyond. I'm Elizabeth, and today I am very excited to share my interview with Claire Ghetti with you. I had the distinct pleasure of attending the University of Kansas with Claire many years ago, and it was such a privilege to learn from her and with her during that period of time. And she just has so much to offer our profession, so I really hope that you enjoy this interview. But before we get to that, let's learn a little bit about Claire. Claire Ghetti is professor of music therapy at the Grieg Academy Music Therapy Research Center at the University of Bergen in Norway. Claire's research centers on how music and the relationships that are enabled through musicking serve as resources for health in intensive medical contexts. Claire has published research and theoretical work in the area of music therapy as procedural support for invasive medical procedures, music therapy for hospitalized children at risk for traumatization, and resource-oriented approaches to music therapy for parents of premature infants. Claire is also the co-editor-in-chief of the open access, social justice-oriented online journal, Voices, a world forum for music therapy. Before we get to the episode, let's hear a word from our sponsor. Music Therapy and Beyond is sponsored by Bear Paw Creek, the maker of creative movement products that will inspire you. Bear Paw Creek equips teachers, therapists, and parents as they seek to enrich the lives of others through creative movement products and music. Bear Paw Creek understands the importance of music and movement for developing healthy minds and bodies of all ages. We at Music Therapy and Beyond especially love the Connect a Stretchy Band, which has a buckle system that allows you to use the bands straight or buckled into a circle. They also carry a colorful line of ribbon and chiffon streamers, creative movement scarves, balloon balls, and square and textured beanbags. Bear Paw Creek's creative movement products are proudly 100% manufactured in the heart of the country in Missouri, in the United States of America. Find what you need today at bearpawcreek.com. And don't forget to follow them on social media at Bear Paw Creek. Let's get to the interview. Welcome to the podcast, Claire.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
It's so nice to have you all the way from Norway. I'm so excited to see you. It's been many years since I've seen you in person.
It's a pleasure to be with you,
Yes.
even if it's virtual.
Yes. I did the math this morning. I was like, yeah, okay, I think it's 14 years since I met you. And then I think maybe something like 10 years since I've physically seen you in person.
Yeah, I've been here for 8 years already.
Well, that's really wild. Yes, we're very excited to talk about your experience as an expat, as a researcher, all the things. But before we get to all of that, I know that our listeners would really love to just hear a little bit about your journey, how you became a music therapist, how you became a researcher, a professor, how you ended up in Norway. So as much or as little as you feel comfortable sharing about your professional journey, we would love to hear it.
Sure. I'll try to make it concise.
Doesn't have to be.
No, so I started out, I guess maybe I should say that I'm a daughter of an engineer and a homemaker. So partly I always knew when I went into music in my undergraduate degree that I had to do something practical. I had to make sure that I could have an income and support myself thereafter. So I had thought about that, but for whatever reason, I didn't really know about music therapy until I got into undergraduate school. So I was double majoring actually in flute performance and French. And at some point I sort of thought, what am I actually going to do as a profession or a career in these two areas that I'm not so interested in spending endless hours in the practice room and using my efforts to perfect something on my instrument. For me, the joy and the meaning of music was doing it in relation to other people and in collaboration with other people. And I happened to pick an instrument based on what an older sister of my friend played. So it wasn't like I really had a great attachment to my main instrument anyway, but I just kept on playing that because it enabled me to have a way to make music with other people and be a part of an orchestra or a wind ensemble. And that was more interesting to me at that time. So I knew there was something very important in music. I also had some personal experiences of very salient times where music was used in mourning and loss that were very strong and made me realize that when there are no words, that you have music, and that it has such a broad range of ways that it expresses the human condition and all of the existential things we grapple with without having to put that into words. And to me, that was something that felt very important, and I knew I had to go towards that and wasn't quite sure how. Like I was saying, at some point I realized I need to do something that combines these things. I was also interested in psychology and medicine and neurology, and for a while thought, should I do music, neuroscience, or psychology, or become a social worker, or go work in other countries or in places that needed support. And I finally heard about music therapy and then realized, oh, this is something that could combine those things, which is a common theme for music therapists. So that's how I found my way into music therapy. And then in my training, there was a certain orientation that was mostly cognitive behavioral, strong in research, strong in theory development. And that was a great starting point for me and a great foundation. And then when I went into practice, I realized, oh, there's so much more and different ways of understanding the practice orientation that expanded my view there.
Yeah.
And it was in practice actually in New York City with children in the hospital. And I also worked alongside that with adults with HIV and AIDS who many of them had histories of substance use and very difficult growing up in very difficult life situations that they had lived through. And I like that balance of the different areas. And what I found most interesting was trying to understand what's going on in the interpersonal interactions within someone when they make a discovery about themselves with music, or when they connect with someone else through music. So those processes were very interesting to me. And eventually, after several years of practice, I thought I have an ability to be very detail-oriented and think systematically and go in depth with things that I'm interested in. And I thought maybe I should try to use that in a way to contribute to our field or to challenge our field, but on a larger level than the one-to-one interaction with the people that I was working with in music therapy. So at some point I thought, oh, this I could expand research, but I definitely want to go beyond and challenge and question what I learned about research in my master's degree. So during my PhD, I really did that and was quite interested to break out of the mold of sort of an objectivist epistemological framework and approach to research and see, okay, what else is out there and how can we understand what knowledge is, and how can we understand how we develop knowledge through research? Who is it? Is it constructed? Does it exist already? And uncovering it. So then I started getting more into philosophy of science and understanding epistemology and other aspects that lay behind how we understand research. And that was a lot more interesting to me because it was sort of taking the mask off or something and revealing, oh, this is really, this is huge out there and endless. And now what do we do with it? So that expanded my interest in research. And I have been someone who's always had a variety of ways that I am interested in engaging research. And I also want to challenge my own self and my assumptions. So that's partly why I ended up becoming an expat, or moving out of the context in which I had lived and worked in the United States, because I wanted to be challenged and open things up.
Yeah. You were asking some massive questions while you were in school. But I think that's explains perfectly why you are a researcher, because that's what I think of when I think of researchers. They want to keep asking the questions and keep looking wider and bigger and farther, because there are more questions. Every time you answer a question, there's another question that
Yes.
follows it, and there's more to learn. And that's what's really cool about research, I think. So, yeah, I think that's really amazing. And it sounds like it fits your personality perfectly and just the way you think about the world. So that's really cool to hear how you got to that point. And it doesn't sound like maybe you always pictured being a researcher or a professor, that maybe your journey was a little more
Yeah, that's very true. I'm
linear.
someone who doesn't want to know what's coming up in the future, actually. Somehow I've never been the person to say, oh, I want this and this and this out of my life, to get married, have children, have a house. Like that, that's never actually popped into my mind. It's more of what is most important to me, and what do I follow or invest in or spend my time in. And I want it to be unexpected and unknown. I think it would
Yeah.
be very boring if I just decided I'm going to do this and then I'm going to follow that and become that. So no, I didn't know become a researcher. I mean, that's part of my identity. It's not my sole identity. But it became something that seemed like, okay, this is maybe a good place for me to use my efforts and my time.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe there's some aspect that I can bring to this that might be unique or complement what's being done by all the other great people that we have in our field and other fields that inform us. So yes, in some ways it was kind of unexpected to find myself doing that,
Mm-hmm.
and definitely very unexpected to be doing that in a different country than the one where I
Yes.
was educated.
And we're going to get to that in a minute. I did want to mention that in our show notes, I'm going to be linking some of the research articles that I can find free access to of yours, because you
Oh,
have done some really wonderful research that even the research you're doing from afar is contributing to our field in the US. And I think that's one of the cool things about music therapy, is that it does cross borders, because music is a universal language and we all do tend to use it very similarly. So I'm going to share a lot of that with our listeners in case they're unaware of your research, because I think it's really important and special, and I really enjoy digesting it. So thank you for that.
sure.
And you kind of answered this a little bit, but I'd love to hear a little bit more of what you do like about research, about being a researcher. What are some things that you really like about it?
I guess it's because it reflects that desire I have to open things up, question things, and try to understand why or how something's happening. I remember in New York, I was called in for jury duty at one point. And I was a consultant, mostly a music therapist. So that meant if I was on jury duty for 2 or 3 weeks, I wouldn't have any income for that
Yeah.
time. So it was a hardship. But I do remember that during the questioning of the potential jurors, I realized that the questions they were asking us they were impacting how we were understanding what was going on. They were already sort of biasing us in the way that they questioned us. I remember
Mm.
asking, it's like, excuse me, but isn't it so that the way that you're asking this question right now will make us make this assumption that could potentially influence our opinions later in our decision as jurors? And then I got kicked out, so I was not called upon.
No more
But I
questions.
realized, like, I have trouble sort of holding my mouth when I'm curious about something, and then also feel sort of free to question things. And so
Yeah.
sometimes people aren't pleased with that, and it can cause some problems. But I think that's what's interesting to me about research, is that
Yeah.
for me, it's not, again, based on my assumptions of what is possible to know and how we know things. I don't believe that there is a single truth out there, or that there is a knowledge already existing. I believe that humans have a hand in creating that, and anything that we do with research is a construction to some degree of the partners that are involved in that. So I'm interested to bring that message out to a larger audience, so that people don't just ingest research without questioning some of the assumptions behind
Mhm.
how it's generated and created. At the same time, it is complex, as you were mentioning earlier, and there are different forms of research. There are different types of power that come with certain methodologies, and forms of research, with certain audiences that have political import, that have influence on policies and whatnot. So I also acknowledge that and realize that our field obviously has to engage in a broad range of methodologies and ways of doing research. But I also do as well, as a part of realizing that there are different considerations and things that we weigh when we engage in research. And ultimately, we want to make the world a tiny bit better place, or contribute to something, to reducing people's suffering, or to creating connection, or to promoting health. But there are different ways to do that. And we're always compromising. It's always a compromise of some sort when you're doing research. You're always telling just a piece of some sort of story.
Yes.
So it's important to acknowledge that.
Well, it seems like too that focus is important. If you get off topic or you go too broad with it, then you aren't going to be able to answer the questions very well. So you kind of have to have a lot of patience too, it seems. So like, this is the piece that we're going to look at right now. And then maybe we'll get to these other pieces the next time we get to talk about this topic or ask more questions. Because
that's exactly true. And unfortunately, that doesn't work very well in the time of Twitter and things, where people want a small little bit of information and they just want to look at one little piece, or they want to reduce a large complexity into a couple of words. And you're always just getting a little bit of the story. Even right now, we're writing our main time point paper for a large randomized controlled trial. And the way that we're writing the manuscript is in order to submit it to a medical journal. And of course, there they value very short, concise stories. And then you can have other supplementary information that broadens that a tiny bit. But you're compromising there and having a little bit of a message that you can give with tiny bits of details shoved in there in a very concise way, if you can do that subtly. But it's always a compromise. And then even with that reduction, there's some complexity in that, but then the person who reads it probably just reads the abstract or the concluding paragraph or something like that. And then maybe they reduce that to 5 words or 10 words. And when they say, this is what music therapy does or it doesn't do. So I think as humans, we just naturally reduce things and take a piece that is most salient to us and disregard everything else. So the trick with research is trying to contextualize things and not lose the context if possible, and to appreciate that complexity, but then also realizing it's sort of out of your control at some point.
I remember when, I can't remember what the piece of research was, but something came out about singing and the transmission of, respiratory illness. And it got reduced very quickly on the internet, and really cost music therapists quite a bit of work during the pandemic, because then hospitals were seeing this article or this retweet of this article and saying, okay, singing's bad, so you can't sing, so you can't be here. And then it was really problematic for a lot of people, and it took a lot of education to be like, okay, this was one article from one person one time, like this wasn't a bunch of different studies that were done on this topic. We're still learning about how this actually works. And I think it was quite difficult for a lot of people to recover from that, because they had to provide so much education around what's actually happening when we sing and how we protect our clients when we're providing therapy, and that singing's not the only thing that we do in music therapy, that there's other things that we do. It can be kind of a double-edged sword, it seems. It's great to be able to get a nugget of information that's really powerful for people, but it can also cause harm if it's misinterpreted or not disseminated in the right way.
Yes, and we can see from our preliminary time points of this large trial called Long Step. It's a longitudinal randomized controlled trial of music therapy for premature infants and their parents, where we're using a form of music therapy where we support parents to learn how to use their voices and adapt it to meet the needs of their infant in the moment. So it's parent-led in a way, and it's directed at the infant, and the infant directs it as well by their their signals and their cues, behavioral cues in the moment. But we saw from our published results of discharge that there wasn't any differences that was statistically significant between the groups in bonding, which was our main outcome. And then we have already heard some feedback from very concerned music therapists saying, you know, our neonatologists on our unit saw this article and are concluding that music therapy doesn't work. And then I say, okay, well, turn back to that person, bring them the meta-analyses we have that pulled together several RCTs in order to have a larger power in order to say, okay, across studies, what are we seeing when we can pull together this data? And there we see positive effects of music therapy, and you can't reduce one study with one intervention with one set of outcomes that says, okay, there's no relationship between this particular intervention and these particular outcomes. Not between, we're not saying between music therapy and all potential outcomes and all forms of music therapy. And you can't do that. You can't reduce it that much. And I think if music therapists can get a little bit faster and a little bit more willing to counter and go back and be strong in their education and what they have to bring and secure in that to counter and say, okay, open up any issue of the JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, or Lancet or something else, and you can see how many interventional studies don't have significant results.
Right.
And they, you know, this is par for the course for behavioral research, for interventional research, cancer treatments, you name it, that we are not alone in this. But it's very easy for other people, like you were saying, to shorten things and reduce them and just say music therapy doesn't work. And that's not true for the first, and it's not responsible either. So we do, as music therapists, have to sort of stand up to that and counter that actively.
Yeah. Well, and that confidence can come from actually reading and understanding the research that's been done and staying up to date on what's happening. Because if you only read one abstract every 6 months from one article, then you're not really understanding the work that's continuing to be done on a daily basis to continue to beef up that evidence base that we rely on to create our jobs and secure our jobs and maintain our jobs over time. So I think it can be overwhelming to think about reading articles if you're not a person that naturally ingests those and understands them. But there are so many more resources out there that help you to understand what's going on in these articles and how the research works and what the findings mean and all of that. So I think the accessibility is better than it's ever been. So hopefully that helps people to feel less intimidated about reading it for themselves and trying to understand it so that they can defend their jobs if needed, or create new jobs, or just continue to do the education and advocacy that is a daily part of being a music therapist these days.
It really is. And I know people get very tired with that, just advocating and explaining what music therapy is on a daily basis. So then having to also be an advocate for the effect or the impact or the worth of it, whatever you want to, however you want to look at it, can also be quite tiring.
Yeah, it is. But it's important. And if you can balance it, what we find at my private practice is that we do a certain amount of free demonstration when we are confident that the impact is going to communicate enough for someone to sign on for a service. So occasionally we'll do a free session at a group home with one person and invite all of the staff to come to the session. And then after they've seen it, then they sign on afterwards. They understand what it is that we're talking about. And we always provide the information and the research first in that initial conversation and say, this is what music therapy is, this is what it does. And then if we feel that sort of hesitance behind signing on, then sometimes we'll offer this demonstration and say, why don't we come and just show you what it looks like? And it almost always results in someone saying, yeah, I do see the value in that. I do want that service. So.
And that's a form of evidence, I would argue, in itself. And often the most poignant form of evidence is someone's personal experience of it, either being invited in like that, having a coworker as a music therapist, or having family experience, or going through oneself as a client. So it's also important for music therapists to realize that that is also legitimate too. It's not just randomized controlled trials, or it's not just people with PhDs doing research studies. There's all forms of ways of substantiating the worth we do. And ideally, it would be a lot more often substantiated by the users of music therapy themselves. And that's something that we have in Norway, a much stronger presence and valuing of user perspectives and involvement and generation of research ideas and projects and being involved in that as well. So
yeah,
that's some way that my horizons have grown since I've been here.
Well, and I think that might be a valuable thing to explain to our listeners because you do a certain type of research that maybe not everybody knows or understands, the phenomenological research. So, would you feel comfortable maybe kind of giving a nutshell explanation of what that type of research is and why you do that research?
Sure. Yeah. So I have I have multiple identities as a researcher. It's hard for me to decide where to go. I feel like one can be plural as a researcher too, that doesn't have to decide, okay, I'm just going to go in one direction or another. But I think the methodology that maybe is most close to my heart and interests is something in the realm of interpretive or hermeneutic phenomenology, where together with someone who's experienced a phenomenon that you're interested in looking closer at, you dialogue and co-create an understanding of what that experience was. And of course, that process of reflecting back on a phenomenon changes that becomes its own phenomenon. The intentionality and perceiving something. But I also feel like it's a very rich way to look at research. So an example from the past is when I, myself as a music therapist, when I wanted to start working in a medical hospital, there weren't any positions available. So I was in contact with one hospital and they said, okay, well, the best you can do is maybe learn, get training in child life as a profession, and you can do an internship here. And then during that time, while you're working in a fellowship as a child life specialist, you can then be applying for grants for music therapy, and maybe eventually we'll get funding for that. And so that's actually what I did. And I was curious thereafter. So I was a music therapist that eventually did an additional training in child life. At that point in time, you didn't need to have a degree in child life. You could sort of not grandfather in, but you could have equivalency from creative arts therapy or other areas like that, and then do a certain amount of internship experience and then sit for an exam. So I got into child life in that direction, but it was an interesting way of thinking and a new tool set and a way to connect with people that was a little bit different than music therapy. And yet, being a music therapist, I came to it in a very specific way, I guess, or a different way. And then I was curious about what then was possible when one was dual trained and practiced in that sort of way and had a practice setting that allowed you as a clinician to decide what is going to be most appropriate, what does the client want or the context need or the family need, and then how can I move through those different aspects of my identity or ways I can be with someone in those two different frames. And so I was curious to study that, not just because I thought it was interesting in practice to sort of meld these and find new opportunities through having both types of education. I was curious about other music therapists who were dual certified, and did they practice in a way that aligned most as a music therapist or a child life specialist or some combination of both. And so I conducted, as part of my doctoral studies, a hermeneutic phenomenological study, an IPA, interpretive phenomenological analysis study that looked at people who had this dual types of training. And so that type of research, you're generally doing semi-structured interviews and having very rich conversations with people that are fairly open-ended, allow them to go into reflecting on a phenomenon. You might have something like audio recordings or some sort of data or artifact that they're responding to bring them to a space or a time, or you might ask them to reflect on something in advance or just come in and reflect to the questions that are coming up and following up with that. But the idea is that you get into exploring together someone's experience of something that they lived through. So in this case, they lived through being a dual certified child life specialist and music therapist, and what was that experience like for them. And I'm not assuming, because of my epistemological framework, I'm not assuming that each person has the same experience and we're going to get down to the one experience that's universal. It's more of like, here are all of the participants are going to all come with their unique contexts and experiences, and we're going to try to understand what did it mean for them, and then see what things start to converge to some degree or resonate between their accounts, and which things are very individual and specific and not reflected in other people's accounts, and what can this tell us about the range of what is experienced and possible. So that feels like always a very fascinating way of doing research for me. And then also when you're analyzing the data, it gets very rich because the descriptions are so real. They're coming from the people who have been through it, and they get to decide what it is to them. It's not me deciding, but of course, as the researcher, I'm interpreting and doing my own level of sort of understanding and meaning making on top of what they have done in the interview.
Well, and there's so much value in people just being able to tell their story and share their own experience, not just the experience itself, but the reflection on the experience afterwards can be really powerful too. And I wonder if that would be a great transition for us, for you to be able to reflect on your experience now as an expat and researcher. I'd really love to kind of talk about what that process was like for you to come to be in Norway and live there, work there. Just what has that been like for you? Maybe we could start with what made you want to explore becoming an expat, and we can kind of go from there.
So I am in a long-term relationship, which means that I'm not an independent operator. So it was after I finished my PhD, I moved back to New York and worked there for a couple more years, and did sort of the academic thing on the side as an adjunct professor, and thought, okay, this is maybe what I'm going to need to do, because there aren't that many academic programs in the United States. If you think of other fields of study or clinical positions, there's not that many positions. There's not that many universities that have dedicated time set aside for research or prioritize that. And for my husband, who's an architect and a musician, he needed to be in a cultural environment and a sort of aesthetic environment that could inspire him in his areas of pursuit. So for a while he had said, if you can find a position in Europe or something, maybe we could consider that, because his family comes from Europe, and of course Scandinavian architecture is quite stimulating and nice for people like that. So there was an opportunity at University of Bergen in Norway that came open, and I was sort of joking like, oh, this would be my dream job. There's an excellent research milieu there. They have all different types of research that they do, a wonderful complement of colleagues there. And there's teaching obviously involved as well, but I said, I realized, that's a huge move for him to do as my partner, but he was willing to test it out. So luckily he came for the interview, and then we decided that maybe it was something we could try. It was difficult we came from New York City. So moving from New York City to most other places is difficult when you become accustomed to what's available culturally and with diversity there, backgrounds, everything, to what you can eat and experience is quite broad. So it was important that we were in a milieu or in a city here that had a very strong cultural presence and a wonderful music scene and other aspects that we value engaging in our personal lives. And Bergen really has that, even though it's a tiny town compared to New York City. It's like a little village to us. But it's also very rich and cosmopolitan in a way, because it is the second largest city in Norway. So there's a lot of mix of things that are going on here, and wonderful arts programs and music and opportunities here. So we've actually attended some of the most fantastic concerts we've ever experienced in our lives here.
Wow.
Often because it's smaller venues and you can get closer to the artists, and very good sound quality in a lot of venues. So we've had some wonderful experiences here.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So I wonder what were kind of the initial barriers then? You kind of expressed your concerns with the cultural aspect moving from New York specifically, but what other things did you kind of run into when you were figuring this out?
Yeah, I guess we figured any move was going to be difficult, but it takes a huge amount of effort actually to make a longer term international move, especially from the United States. For example, with the tax situation, we have to, of course, report tax every year, even though we don't have any income in the United States, and it's still a 72 or something page tax form that we're returning, even though we have no income in the United States, and that'll be the same throughout the rest of our lives. So there's some technicalities like that it takes a lot to figure out how to transfer some of the logistical aspects of having the ID number here in Norway that you need to enter the country, and the residence permits and things worked out, the rights to work and so forth, but then also banking and all of that stuff. So there were a lot of logistic things that we had to figure out, a lot of it on our own and using the internet. And there are expat groups in Norway. There's one Facebook group even, and there's several blogs and online resources for specifically American expats in Norway. So that helps to see people who've gone through the same situation. And I think that probably pertains to other countries too, where you can do a lot of research now with the internet that wasn't originally that information available to decades in the past. So some of that logistic challenge, there was also a bit of the language. I have to say, though, the threshold is lower here to moving as someone who never knew Norwegian before coming here, because there are English instruction is mandatory in the schools starting from elementary school. So generally they say if someone's below 70 something or above 7 years of age, then they have been in that system to learn English, that they at least can understand you almost perfectly, everything you say in English, if not also speak impeccable English. Not all Norwegians want to have to do that, but generally they're very, very skilled at English, writing it and reading and understanding. So that's maybe an advantage if you're moving here as an English speaker. At the same time, I think it's very important when everyone is an expat to have a good amount of cultural humility, to make sure that you're not expecting your culture and way of doing things to have to be enforced when you're coming into someone else's culture and background. So being open to self-reflecting and understanding what is it that I'm bringing into the situation that might not match here. And even though I'm generally a fairly quiet person and generally listen pretty well, I think my time in New York made me a little bit more willing that in a meeting I might blurt out like, "Oh, I have a question," or "Could you say that again?" or something like that. And I thought I was doing it as a way to engage and make sure I really understand my Norwegian colleagues, what they were saying. But I realized pretty quickly that you don't ever interrupt when someone is speaking. It's terrible. It's terribly rude. Instead, you wait very patiently till they're finished, and then you ask for the word. You raise your finger. There's certain finger symbols depending on whether you have a new topic or whether you're just responding to what someone has just said. But you don't ask for clarification in the middle of what someone's saying. You need to wait, and then later you can ask that afterwards. And so with the way my brain works, I sort of lose track of where I was. So I had to start writing things down, like, "Oh, I have to ask about that," because I wouldn't remember that when it came time to actually ask questions or take the word or whatnot. So even things like that about how do meetings work and how do people share the word and what is most important here. A Norwegian might feel more comfortable physically bumping into you and not say anything, because that's not, but if you interrupt them when they're speaking, that is perceived just as rude or inappropriate as if someone bumps into you for us, where it's like, "Oh, watch your personal space," like say, "Excuse me," or something. No, it's not comfortable. So even just small cultural variations like that are important to be aware of. What am I doing in this context that is different? What are other people doing? How do things operate here?
Yeah.
And being sort of humble about coming to that space. And part of that humility was also doing my best and trying to be vulnerable myself to try to learn the language as soon as I could, and really trying to throw myself into that. So that it wasn't enforcing a language that I feel most comfortable in, but maybe other people in Norway don't feel most comfortable in English. So having to be in that vulnerable place myself.
Do you think, would you feel comfortable defining music therapy in Norwegian for us right now? Like, could you just say a quick?
I don't feel comfortable defining music therapy at all. So no.
No elevator speech from you today. Okay, that's all right. I just thought I'd ask.
Well, maybe I'll say something later, but
okay, you can think about it. I'm just curious to hear something music therapy speak, just because I think it would be fascinating. But did you come across all of this cultural knowledge pretty organically, or did you seek out a mentor or those groups? Did you rely on those groups? Kind of what else did you do to kind of understand the do's and don'ts of where you're living?
There was a wonderful person who worked for the university here in a Center for International Mobility, which I thought that's an interesting.
Yeah.
Some of the ways that they translate things into English are a little bit different uses of them that I think are interesting. So that one was, I thought, oh, should I be mobile? Should I keep moving? Move here for a while, move somewhere else. But I think because there's a huge amount of researchers that come from other countries that work in Norway. And part of that is because they need to, it's a very small country. So they have to bring in PhD candidates and others from other areas to sort of fill all the needs. But because of that, then there's a lot of people that are curious and don't know the language or don't know the customs or the norms and that sort of thing. So there was a wonderful person who worked there who was very helpful in the first couple of months or years to explain some things or put us in contact with resources. Otherwise, my immediate colleagues have been very helpful when it comes to appreciating finer points of the language and all the cultural aspects that lie behind the language. There are actually two written languages here, one that's more influenced by the Danish and the time when Denmark was ruling Norway. And then there's one that's more used on the west side of Norway that was reassembled Norwegian from older times by someone who went around and tried to gather all the dialects and put that into a written language to try to reduce that influence of the privileged Danish that seeped into Norwegian. So it's not just one written language and one spoken language. There's these two written languages and then countless dialects that either align more with one of the written languages or the other one. So that makes it quite difficult when you're trying to understand people speaking Norwegian. And there are some dialects that are so divergent that Norwegians with these different dialects, when they're asked to collaborate on a project, like build a sandcastle or something, or like build this project, and then they have to describe things together to each other in their dialects that they don't understand each other either. So it can be very challenging internally. So that makes a bit of a barrier, but I think it is quite important to try to open up and learn it as best one can.
Yeah, I would imagine you would have trouble feeling at home if you never learned the language. Like always feel a little bit on the outside of certain things.
Yeah, that was definitely a case for us. And I think we also try to make a point of not predominantly befriending and seeking out Americans, because we wanted to make sure that we got to know socially Norwegians and understood more what is it like to live here and their backgrounds. And we were very curious and open to learning about people and what's influencing them. So I think that helped a bit, because then we started having a lot of socialization or socializing in Norwegian that helped with the language development. So our friends were very patient as we went through that awkward transition of many years of like, long dinner parties where they could speak Norwegian and we could say a little bit. And then eventually at a certain point in the evening, it switches to English because we get very tired and Norwegian disappears.
Wow. Well, it sounds complicated but doable. So that's encouraging to hear that even a language that I would deem more intimidating, like I would probably sooner learn Italian or French than Norwegian, but it sounds like, you're making it work and you're learning it. So I'm curious, especially thinking about the language, was that a challenge when it came to conducting research, or were there other barriers that were more difficult in researching there?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it took about 3.5 years of living here and really trying. From the first semester, we took 3 consecutive semesters of Norwegian instruction. So I was trying from the first semester to read it, understand it, speak some as much as I could, but it really took about 3.5 years before I felt any hope of one day becoming fairly fluent. And then the whole first 3.5 years was feeling hopeless, but trying as hard as I could. But then sticking with it, then it finally comes. And partly a bit of that is because Norwegians are so good at English that in a store or something like that, they'll very quickly switch over to English when they realize that you're struggling, or if you even make a face that like, I didn't quite hear you or something like that, then they'll switch. So tip from my husband was to ask en gang til, ask something in Norwegian that's like, one more time, please, or could you say that again, in Norwegian, and then people just automatically, if you say it sort of fast enough, and then they'll just say it in Norwegian again. Versus if you just look at them confused, they'll switch to English, or they'll slow it down, or they'll say it louder or something like that. And for me, I often have trouble when I can't hear conversation. So it's very difficult at lunch breaks, for example, if I'm chewing or that sort of thing. It's just enough that I can't do figure ground and can't hear what people are saying. So that was a challenge. But I think research, I would say, influenced decisions with research. I think it was more of a challenge with teaching, because the first semester, my colleague, we co-taught a little bit, and he was asking the students, okay, can you please speak in English for Claire, because obviously she doesn't understand any Norwegian whatsoever. And they were a little bit like, okay, if we have to. And I didn't realize how much they were quietly, with flat affect, we would say, passive face, resisting that. It's very, very subtle here. Expressing yourself is often done in a very articulate way, I feel here, in a very reasoned way, not so much in an impassioned way, unless someone is drinking alcohol, and then it becomes very loud and impassioned. So these things are very subtle, especially working with students. It's very subtle to see how are they engaged at all. You don't get the same feedback as you do with I experienced with American students, where you could tell very quickly, are they bored, or are they like, hey, this is great? And you'd have a lot of seeing that on their faces and how you interacted with them. So I think teaching was difficult. And after the first semester, I just said, okay, you all speak in Norwegian, and I'll speak in English because I can't say enough in Norwegian, but let's see how this goes. And honestly, I couldn't understand what they were saying sometimes. But I got it was sort of like a gestalt thing, where I could feel like a general gist of what they were saying. And I also realized that sometimes people just need the space, and that here they're very good at working collaboratively and constructively together in groups. So if you could just structure the instruction and the teaching so that they're sharing with each other and sharing something important and furthering each other's thought process, then you could get over that hump of like, okay, I think I missed that, but something important is happening here, and we developed that. So we actually sort of co-created some understanding, and I got a lot from them. Maybe they got something from me. But it was definitely like a shared space. But then they opened up when they got to speak in their mother tongue and weren't forced to speak something that they didn't necessarily want to. It was such a huge difference. And then I also felt a big shift again in teaching when I switched to trying to speak Norwegian for most of my teaching. And I felt like it was very rudimentary language that I had and was very basic and boring, but things that I explained very carefully in English in the preceding semesters and had lots and lots of questions, I explained them in very elementary Norwegian and had no questions. So somehow the amount of information was simple enough that it got through. And so I realized, okay, I guess I'm communicating something if people aren't having questions and they're understanding what I'm saying. So that opened up to trying even more teaching. So I primarily teach in Norwegian. Sometimes I have to switch to English if there's something I just can't describe. And then they're always speaking Norwegian to me. But with research, the challenge was that I'm used to doing research that's more on a level of exploring something that I'm interested in from practice. And then in my doctorate, I was the music therapist and the researcher simultaneously. And that's very interesting for me. I like to sort of be present and consider this, what I'm asking other people to do, or what's evolving in the process of music therapy and how people make sense of that. So when I thought of doing research, it did impact me when I moved to Bergen. In the first place, I've been quite interested in intensive care settings in pediatrics, and mostly those patients are being shipped over to Oslo if they have, an emergent trauma that's that intense. And otherwise, it's just a very small unit here. So some of my expectations of who I might do research with varied depending on, or changed based on what was actually available here. And so I moved into a little bit more into this area of neonatal intensive care music therapy and music therapy, in that context with parents, because I have research collaborators here at my research center who have backgrounds in that area or in methodology. And we very early on thought, okay, what areas can we actually collaborate in while I don't have the language at this point? And it seemed like that was a natural place to begin. So I moved sort of predominantly into that area because we were successful with grant funding and could collaborate on that. But I did want, when there was a chance to do a feasibility study, I was actually a music therapist working with a few families in Bergen here, and was able to try out what we were suggesting doing in our intervention and do that in person. So it's impacted sort of who and what I can do at that point. Now it's broadening a little bit more as I get more of the language.
Well, it sounds like you're figuring it out, and you're making it sound like a really wonderful place to exist. So are you recruiting anyone to come to Bergen?
Actually, yes, because we were lucky enough that we got funding again from the Research Council of Norway to do a project that pivots on some of the data that we have from our study LongStep. We have some videos that we're able to look at in microanalysis. So we're going to look very carefully at interactions between parents and their infants when they're using music therapy. How are they using their voices, and how are they contributing to mutual regulation and calming the infant down in the intensive care setting? So I will be announcing a position for a PhD student, actually. 4-year position that will be announced, I think, in Norwegian and English, and probably sometime in the new year will be announced, and we'll be hoping to fill that in August or September this coming year.
Well, congratulations.
So like that. And I can't say if there are other music therapists or other students who are interested in studying in Norway. It's in some ways, if you want to do it at the master's level, at least for our program, we are still a Norwegian speaking program. So students have to know Norwegian and meet the language competency before they start studying in the program. So that makes it a lot more restrictive when people want to study abroad with us at the master's level. At the PhD level, that doesn't apply. So you can come even if you don't know Norwegian and apply for positions and potentially get appointed a position. And the nice thing about that is there is a living wage, which is different than in the United States. A lot of music therapy PhD positions, it's not a living wage. It's very difficult to do financially. Here it is a very decent wage, and you're treated as they do all employees here. It's a good quality of the working environment and the rights that you have as a worker. So that is definitely a positive.
Yeah. Has that influenced you, the things that you're noticing people value there, or place importance on? Has that changed things that you value over time by living there, just culturally and otherwise?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, generally, Norway is a social democracy. A lot of the parties are social democratic, if not further shades of leftist, socialist, and so forth. So definitely there's more of a concern, an acknowledgement that one needs to be concerned about one's fellow human and the environment, but that it is a welfare state. So there is a very good health offer that's available here to everyone who lives here, where you can get healthcare without having to pay exorbitant amounts for it. But that also education, for example, is provided by the state. There are some fees, but essentially tuition is covered. So you have the right to secondary education to university, regardless of your background. So there are some things that I value, and that are more stable aspects of what the government enforces here and what the regulation enables. So that's very positive to me. I feel like I can make a contribution here that's consistent and live in a place that's consistent with my values and my beliefs. And as far as music therapy, there are a lot of that more collectivist in a way, or more socially oriented, community oriented focus that I think exists in Norway, also pervades into the music therapy approaches. And I think in Norway, it's developed over time by having these very small communities that were across, a mountain and a fjord from the next one, and they had their own dialects and married each other, and it was very difficult to travel to other places. You had to wait for the ice or something for certain activities to go over the ice and whatnot. So there was a lot of isolation, and people had to depend on each other to exist. Yeah. And so some of those concepts, like the dugnad, is like a collaborative effort. Whenever there's something that needs to be done, you all pitch in and everyone just donates time and makes it happen. So that might happen at your apartment building. Okay, we're going to have a dugnad today, and everyone's going to work and clean up all the flower beds and clean up, other aspects of the building. Or we have it in the university, like tidy things up. And so people are used to, okay, some efforts, we just have to come together and help each other. So I think that goes back to that history of being, farming communities, and you have to raise a barn, or you have to do something else. It's like, we need everyone to come together and make this happen. So that comes also into the focus in music therapy, where there's less focus on music therapy as a one-to-one treatment in a very private, isolated setting, and more of a community focus in understanding that music is a resource for health for everyone. It shouldn't be made to be exclusive, and that we should also question some of this expertise of the music therapist. Is that really helpful to create this division between the therapist and the user, the client, or aren't we all users of music? So some of that aspect of resource orientation with Randy Rolfsjord, my colleague, and cultural centered perspectives, and community music therapy with Brynjolf, for example, Stiga, are filtering into ways that I'm thinking also of music therapy in medical contexts, and purposely wanting to sort of turn things on its head, or question some of the practices that privilege the expertise of the music therapist. And I think especially in the United States, because of the way the healthcare system works, and because of the prioritization of expertise and consumerism, capitalism as a structure that really pervades everything, the health system and everything there, education, that I think obviously in the United States, music therapists have decided for the most part to try to distinguish themselves from other professionals, from non-music therapists who use music in a therapeutic way, to try to retain their spot in their profession and strengthen their identity and have their territory. And I understand why that's arisen there. In Norway here, we don't have authorization. Right now, we don't have certification or anything like that. Right now, there are guidelines that recommend music therapy in certain contexts, for example, for people who have psychosis. And there, that's based on research that we have that's showing good effects, multiple impacts of music therapy. So then there's a recommendation that it should be available for people who want it. So it's again all about the user. What does the user of the health system want in their offer of health? What contributes to their health? Do they think music therapy is something that it would be helpful? If so, they need to have access to services. So here it's more of a right that people have the right to healthcare, and they have the right to be deciding what helps make them healthy instead of having these experts dictate what makes that person healthy.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I hope for us that we can become more client-led and resource-oriented as time goes on, because the longer that I've practiced, the more that I've realized how valuable that really is. I had an opportunity to work with Afghan refugees, and they basically led the session, and it was amazing because I wasn't able to sing in their language or use their instruments, but they were able to take what I brought and show me how they would use the music and what the music meant to them. And they danced, and I don't dance. So it was like, it was awesome to just like watch them take what was in front of them and share their culture with me and teach me something, and to just remove myself as an expert, because I knew 100% I was not an expert in that situation. But even in a typical situation with another person who's similar to myself, who's seeking music therapy, I'm finding more and more the benefit of really letting them lead more of what's going on and really tell me what they need, as opposed to me assuming based off the data that I've been given prior to meeting them, what do they need. And I think there's importance in having that research and more of that cognitive behavioral stuff there. But at the end of the day, humans connecting with other humans and recognizing each other's value is just such a powerful thing. And so I think that's really amazing that the culture over there appreciates that.
Yeah, and what you're pointing to now is just recognizing our own situatedness. And if you're working with people from a different cultural background where music means something different or health means something different, then who are we to impose, or who am I to impose what I think is health or music on someone else, especially if that research is normed on a totally different group or people with different background, or majority status in a country, then it can't necessarily apply. So it is foremost, I think music therapy for me is about making relationships with people, and then with music as well, and figuring out together in collaboration how music can be helpful.
Oh, so exciting. I love hearing about what you're doing over there and everything that you're learning and sharing with the world, because I personally think that you are a gift to our profession, and I'm just so happy to hear that you're doing well over there and continuing to do exciting things.
Thank you. That's very generous of you.
Thank you for talking with us today, because I've learned a lot and I feel really inspired. But I would love it if you could maybe impart some wisdom on our listeners as we close our conversation. So is there any advice that you would give to someone either who's considering becoming an expatriate or considering more of a research path? Anything that you would want to tell to someone who's thinking about those things?
Yeah. Gosh, that's a big question in itself.
Sorry.
I think I would say, don't assume you're not the right person. That's immediately what I thought when this job opening came up. I thought, A, they already have someone that they know that they want to apply for this position, I'm sure. B, they need someone with Norwegian language experience, and I don't have it at all. So I have, they would not want me. It would be ridiculous. So I really thought that was true until actually my friend mentioned she had been here with her, Anita Swanson had been there with her students before, and she's like, no, that's not how it works over there. They're basically bilingual and very open, and they also use a lot of English language music, I guess, in music therapy. So she said, yeah, like try it. And I actually, and I did. And then it turned out to be an opportunity. So I think don't prematurely sort of shut down your opportunities. But then if you do get a chance, I do suggest trying to really be open to questioning your own self and assumptions and background, and having that process to be humble culturally, and to go into a situation to be willing to learn, and to be willing to be the one who needs to learn and who doesn't have power, or, you know, probably, obviously I came to that as an American and a white woman, you know, from a middle-class background, as having power. So I realized I came in a privileged position, coming into that particular position. But I think one needs to be open to learning and taking in the culture, ideally, and not just hoping to live in your same culture that you come from in a different country. I feel like, what's the point? Just stay where you are then. If you're
just
not willing
making it
to
complicated
open
for no
or
reason.
change or be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then also that piece with the logistics. There are a lot of logistics that you have to work through that will not end after you live there. Like taxes, for example, it's very difficult. Also with thinking about saving for retirement and other aspects like that, it gets very, very difficult. So there are some very real obstacles that one has to think through, but it's definitely possible. And so try things, think about it carefully, become educated, and go for those opportunities, because they're definitely out there. And there's definitely a lot of cross-pollination that can happen when people move out of their comfort zone and go into new area. They can learn a lot, and they can also bring new perspectives too.
Definitely. Sage advice. You did great.
Sage advice.
I love it. All right. Can I put you on the spot with one more question?
Yes.
Okay. So you've managed to stay in the same field this whole time. There's been some changes to kind of your specific role within music therapy, but what have you done for yourself to sort of maintain that longevity in maintaining this as a career for yourself? Because we see a lot of burnout. I wonder if it's maybe more in the US than it is in Norway, but in general, kind of what have you done to stay with it?
No, that's hard, because I'm kind of at a point in my career where I feel like, okay, this is the one life I have, and however many remaining years. So I have actually thought about, do I need to do something more, not like in quantity, but on a more global scale? Or lately I've been concerned with women's rights or rights to education, or, you know, and so it's like, should I do something more with human rights out there than I'm doing right now? And that's hard to decide, obviously. People are educated in that and spend their whole careers becoming more relevant in that area. So I might not be very relevant, but it is, you know, it's something that I still struggle with. Is this doing enough in the world that has so many areas where humans are suffering and animals are suffering, and the planet is? Could there be some other use of my energies? So that's a piece of it. I think for me, it's also trying to find meaning. My internship supervisor, one of them for my music therapy internship, was always saying, Molly Richter, she was always saying, make it meaningful. Like, that's the most important thing. Like, was it meaningful? Yes. And I think that's always stayed with me, that is there a positive effect with research or not? Or, you know, were you surprised or not surprised? Or did things fall apart or not? It's like, well, was it meaningful? And who is it meaningful to? And the person engaging in it. Or sometimes it's the meaning comes from all around it. So we found that in our long step study, that it wasn't necessarily meaningful when we looked at the outcome measures, but then so many things happened where music therapists were hired and families were using music and having a new relationship with their infants in a way that we were hoping they would develop from music therapy. So many things were happening. People were getting education and research, or leading research like I was, and so forth. So many things came out of that and were afforded by that study, that were meaningful, that went far beyond what we thought the meaning of a study would be. So I think maybe for music therapists, it's figuring out what is meaningful for you in music therapy, and what does that look like. And you have to develop and you have to evolve, I think, as a music therapist and as a human primarily, to be able to sort of get through this very difficult life that we're all in. And obviously some of us are struggling more than others. But
Yeah.
I think the human condition is to struggle and be uncomfortable. It's like, how can we find meaning in that and tie that
Yeah.
into what we do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I kind of hear sort of threaded throughout this conversation and thinking about research and everything that you've done, just the ability to kind of zoom out for a minute and see the bigger picture of something and then reflect on that to see if you need to do something else. Do you need to pivot? Do you need to try something new? Do you need to get some new training or read a book or just try something else? Because I found because we are such a niche field that it's very easy to become really insular. And I think that contributes to the burnout too, when your world gets really small and you don't see everything else that's happening around you. So I think that's kind of one of the things I'm hearing you say a lot in different ways throughout this
Yeah.
conversation is just being able to really reflect and ask questions and think about what's going on that's bigger than what you're doing in this specific moment. So yeah, I'm feeling
Yeah.
really inspired by everything that you're
There,
saying today.
there's a piece of that, and there's also, just back to burnout. Like you said, this is so real for so many people I know in any helping profession, really, but also in music therapy, because we have to do that piece of always advocating for what do we do, why is it meaningful what we do, why should we exist. We have to do that every single day, and also as educators and researchers in this field. So I think it's important to think about what is the self-care and what feeds you as a person, and to also be open to that might not come from music, or music in addition to something else. And I think for me, one of my best self-care things is actually to go climbing, which is a physical thing. It's also a problem-solving thing, and it totally engages my mind, because I have to be thinking about everything I'm doing. It's just my body and a wall, and to not fall or injure myself. I have to be focusing on that. And I've been really surprised at how helpful that is to me in so many different ways, because it is sort of an antithesis of what I do every day when I sit at a computer or I'm teaching or something, where I'm, especially the research part, where I end up sitting a lot and working with words, and reading texts and writing texts and answering emails and that sort of thing, and to use the whole body, and in a way that completely absorbs your attention. For me, that's something that helps in a way that playing music and engaging in music also is helpful for me, but it doesn't somehow use things in such a different way. And so I think maybe if music therapists also opened up to think about self-care, yeah, but really push yourself to figure out, it's beyond just having coffee or taking a break or 10 minutes or meditation or something, but find something that really feeds you and expands and uses your body and your mind and your soul, or whatever you need to use in a different way, that can really complement your everyday. And I think that can help with longevity as well, just as in whatever your type of work is, to deal with that stress and that strain.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, thank you so much, Claire. I think this has been a really awesome conversation. And I'm just really happy for you where you've landed and what you're doing. So,
Thank you. I feel very fortunate to
yeah.
have had this chance.
I mean, we miss you here because, like I said,
Thank you.
you're
I
you're
know.
a gift, and I would
I
love to
miss you
see you
guys too.
more.
Yeah, exactly.
But
And now also, yeah, also with the environment now, it gets more and more hard to warrant going back to the United States more than once a year.
yeah,
So that's also a thing. But we might have now, after COVID, we might have a lot more digital interactions.
yeah.
And you said that at some point you said the music therapy world feels very big. To me, it feels very, very small because of connecting, and maybe with the work I do at Voices, the journal too, of connecting with people in all sorts of countries, that it just feels like a tiny field where a lot of us know each other. Not obviously, not everyone, but
Yes. I mean, it's all relative, right?
all
Compared to
relative.
other professions, certainly.
Yes.
But yeah, I just have to remind myself that I'm not alone and that there are more people just like me who are going through similar things that I can reach out to and talk to,
Yeah.
and that's why I love our podcast. We get to help people connect with people outside of themselves who are doing similar or different things that they can learn
Yeah.
from and be inspired by. And so I'm really glad that we got to do this today and share you with
Yes.
everyone.
So am I. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thanks for tuning in to Music Therapy and Beyond. For show notes from today's episode, head to our website, musictherapyandbeyond.com. And while you're there, check out our shop. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe to share our work on all platforms. And don't forget to tune in every Monday for another great episode. We'll see you next time.